At 06:14 hours, on the morning of May 7, 1942, Colonel Curtis Beecher stood on the crumbling parapet of Malinta Tunnel on the island of Corregidor, watching the Japanese flag rise over what had been, until 24 hours ago, the last fortified American position in the Philippine archipelago. He was 43 years old. He had fought in the trenches of France in 1918, survived a court-martial he didn't deserve in 1931, and spent the last 5 months eating one-third rations while directing signals intelligence operations under shell fire that averaged 800 rounds per day. He stood 6 feet 1 inch, though he had lost 31 pounds since December, and his khakis hung off him like a scarecrow's clothes. In his breast pocket, he carried a single folded sheet of paper. Not orders, not a letter from his wife in San Francisco. A list of 14 names, a cipher key, and the location of 3 buried radio units the Japanese could not, under any circumstances, find. He had 45 seconds to decide whether to burn it, eat it, or bury it in the rubble at his feet. He buried it. That decision would define the next 90 days of his life, the 90 days that would end him. To understand what Curtis Beecher was protecting, you have to go back further. You have to go back to a specific morning in August of 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, when a signals officer named Major Ralph Schultz drove up to Beecher's bungalow at Fort Stotzenberg and dropped a manila envelope on his breakfast table. Inside that envelope was a directive from Washington that would have seemed to most men like a routine administrative transfer. Beecher was being reassigned to the Signal Intelligence Service, Philippine Department. His cover designation would be Communications Liaison, a title deliberately engineered to sound bureaucratically tedious, at the kind of posting that invited no questions. Beecher read the directive twice. Then he poured another cup of coffee and asked Schultz what Washington actually wanted. What Washington wanted was a man with 2 specific qualities. First, the technical expertise to manage a signals intercept network distributed across a dozen islands, operating in conditions that would degrade most equipment within weeks. Second, the psychological disposition to keep his mouth shut no matter what happened to him. The Signal Intelligence Service had been running intercept operations against Japanese naval and army communications for 3 years by that point. The results, partial breaks in JN-25, the Japanese naval code, confirmed intercepts on the 14th Army's operational frequencies, were among the most sensitive intelligence assets the United States possessed. And if the Japanese captured a man who understood the full scope of the operation, who knew which frequencies were being monitored, which codes were broken and which only partially so, the damage would be incalculable. They would change everything. Every code, every frequency, every operational protocol. Thousands of Americans and Filipinos fighting across the Pacific would pay for that knowledge in blood. Beecher understood this completely. He accepted the assignment without conditions. His wife, Eleanor, drove him to the dock in Manila when he shipped out. She had brown hair and wore a yellow dress and stood very still as the gangway came up. He waved once from the rail. She waved back. Neither of them said anything dramatic. They had been married 16 years, and they had developed, as couples do over long stretches of time, a private vocabulary of gestures that made words largely unnecessary. She knew he was going somewhere dangerous. He knew she would not ask him to stay. He never saw her again. The Philippine campaign, for those unfamiliar with its basic architecture, was a catastrophe assembled with exceptional thoroughness. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack on December 7, 1941, December 8 west of the international date line, Japanese aircraft destroyed the majority of General Douglas MacArthur's air power on the ground at Clark Field, despite 8 hours of warning, as the 14th Army under Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama landed at Lingayen Gulf on December 22 with 43,000 men. MacArthur executed a fighting withdrawal to the Bataan Peninsula and the island fortress of Corregidor at the mouth of Manila Bay, invoking the pre-war plan designated WPO-3. The intent was to hold out until a relief force arrived from Hawaii. The relief force never came. There was nothing to send. On Bataan, had 76,000 American and Filipino troops, held a defensive line of extraordinary complexity against an enemy that controlled the air and the sea. They held it on a diet of mule meat and mongrel dogs and whatever fish could be caught in the South China Sea. They held it through malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and a form of dietary collapse that left men too weak to stand upright. They held it for 99 days, when Bataan fell on April 9, 1942, and it was the largest military surrender in American history. Beecher was not on Bataan, he was on Corregidor, which sits 3 miles offshore, a tadpole-shaped rock 2.5 miles long and half a mile wide, riddled with tunnels and reinforced with concrete gun emplacements, dating back to 1909. The centerpiece was Malinta Tunnel, a system of lateral tunnels carved through solid rock, ventilated by electric fans and lit by strings of bare bulbs. In the final weeks of the campaign, 10,000 men lived inside it. Beecher's section occupied a lateral tunnel 60 meters from the east entrance. They worked in 2 shifts, never less than 4 men at the intercept receivers at any hour. The Japanese artillery fire was, by the end, continuous. The tunnel shook. Dust fell from the ceiling in fine streams. Equipment failed and was repaired and failed again. Through all of it, the intercepts continued. But what Beecher's team was picking up in those final weeks was the operational traffic of the Japanese Southern Army's logistics network and portions of the Imperial Navy's secondary command frequencies. Not the highest level traffic, not the crown jewels, but enough to tell American commanders in Pearl Harbor and Washington that the Japanese were planning a major offensive toward Midway, enough to provide context that would, weeks later, contribute to one of the most consequential intelligence coups of the Pacific War. Beecher knew what he had. He also knew with absolute clarity that he was going to be captured. He prepared accordingly. In the last 72 hours before the surrender, Beecher made a series of decisions that his superior officers, had they known about them, might have considered insubordinate. He had received, through channels, a directive from the Signal Intelligence Service authorizing the destruction of all sensitive materials and the disabling of all intercept equipment before capture. The directive was clear. Burn everything, smash everything, leave nothing that could be reconstructed. Beecher burned the code books. He burned the intercept logs and the cipher keys and the personnel files. He personally smashed 4 of the 5 intercept receivers with a fire axe, working in methodical sweeps down the row of equipment while his men watched in silence. He destroyed the encoding machines by prying out the rotors and dropping them into the cooling water pipes that ran beneath the floor. All of that was by the book. The deviation was this: he kept 3 of the portable shortwave transmitter receivers. Small units, each roughly the size of a large bread box, powered by hand-cranked generators. And he buried them. Along with the list of 14 names, Filipino and American agents distributed across Luzon who were continuing to operate after the surrender, and a partial cipher that could be used to reestablish contact with those agents. His reasoning was clinical and entirely unauthorized. He believed, based on the intercepts he had been reading for months, that the Japanese occupation would not be permanent. He believed American forces would return. When they returned, yet the intelligence network he had spent 5 months building could be resurrected. The agents were still in place. They needed a lifeline. He was providing one at enormous personal risk. He buried the cache in a 3-foot hole beneath a section of collapsed parapet wall, in a location he photographed mentally, with the precision of a man who knows he may not see it again for years. Then he surrendered. The Japanese entered Malinta Tunnel at 1100 hours on May 7th. They came in small groups, armed, moving with the professional confidence of soldiers who had been fighting continuously for 5 months and were accustomed to winning. The American and Filipino prisoners were assembled in the tunnel and the surrounding areas. There was no dramatic moment, no single exchange that defined the transition. It happened in pieces, incrementally, the way most significant events do. Beecher stood with the other officers near the east entrance. He was calm. His hands were still. and he had not slept in 31 hours, but his eyes were clear, and the Japanese intelligence officer who first cataloged him, a Captain Yosuke Tanaka, lean, with wire-rimmed spectacles and an efficient manner, noted this in his initial processing report. Most of the American officers were exhausted past the point of coherent expression. Beecher was not. This was noticed. It was always going to be noticed. The initial processing was perfunctory. Name, rank, serial number, unit designation. Beecher gave them all of these truthfully. His listed unit, Signal Corps, Philippine Department, was accurate. His listed duties, communications liaison, were technically accurate while concealing everything of substance. This was not, in itself, unusual. It was the expected behavior of a captured officer under the Geneva Convention, which both Beecher and Tanaka understood perfectly, and which would prove to be largely irrelevant to what followed. The Bataan death march had already begun, and the prisoners from Bataan, roughly 76,000 men, were being walked 65 miles north to Camp O'Donnell, a process that would kill somewhere between 600 and 10,000 men, depending on which estimate you believe. Corregidor's 10,000 prisoners were processed separately, eventually transferred to camps in Manila, and later to Japan. Beecher was separated from the general population within 4 days. The separation was accomplished quietly, with no specific explanation. He was moved from the common prisoner area to a smaller holding facility near Kindley Field on the island's tail section. He was given a cot, adequate food by the standards of the time, and the company of 3 other American officers who would later report that Beecher spent most of those first days sitting in silence, reading a battered copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that he had somehow retained through the processing. On the 5th day, Tanaka came back, and he brought 2 colleagues and a translator. The conversation that followed was, by the accounts of the 3 officers who witnessed the opening portion before being moved out of the room, entirely civil. Tanaka spoke through the translator in measured, educated sentences. He explained that the Imperial Army was aware of the signal intelligence operation at Corregidor. He explained that this operation had been of material assistance to American commanders during the campaign. And he explained that the Imperial Army wished to understand the full scope of what had been accomplished, and, in particular, to identify which Japanese communications had been successfully intercepted and decoded. He offered Beecher comfortable accommodation in Manila, adequate food, and the opportunity to correspond with his family in exchange for full cooperation. Beecher told him no. Tanaka nodded slowly, as if this was the expected answer, and left. He came back 3 days later. At the interrogation techniques employed by the Kempeitai, the Japanese military police, and the intelligence sections of the Imperial Army during the Pacific War have been extensively documented in the post-war tribunal records, in survivor testimony, and in the official histories. They were not consistent. They varied by facility, by interrogator, by the perceived importance of the prisoner, and by the practical constraints of time and resources. Some prisoners were questioned once and largely left alone. Others were subjected to regimens that would be defined, by any reasonable standard, as systematic torture. Beecher fell into the second category. The specific methods evolved over the course of his 90-day interrogation period. The early sessions were primarily psychological. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, standing or kneeling on hard surfaces for extended periods, measured in hours, sometimes shifting into the second day. Dietary restriction, isolation. These produced in Beecher what the interrogation reports, later recovered and translated in post-war proceedings, described as complete noncompliance. He answered no questions of substance. He repeated his name, rank, and serial number. When they shifted tactics and asked about mundane operational details, the layout of the tunnel, the power supply, the number of personnel, he answered some of these, providing information that was either already known or of no intelligence value. He gave them nothing that mattered. By the 3rd week, the methods intensified. Water interrogation, what the Japanese called mizu-zime, became the primary instrument. Beecher would be restrained supine on a wooden board, a cloth placed over his face, and water poured continuously until the sensation of drowning overwhelmed the body's fundamental resistance to speaking. It was not, technically, drowning. Though the human body's chemistry and neurology do not know that. The panic is real. The suffocation response is real. The impulse to speak, to say anything, to make it stop, is real in a way that pure psychological pressure cannot replicate. Tanaka's successor in the interrogation, a Major Hiroshi Okamoto, who had been brought in specifically because of Beecher's resistance, recorded in his reports that even under Mizuzime, Beecher produced no actionable intelligence. He screamed. He went limp. Yet he went rigid. He passed into unconsciousness twice. He produced vomiting, uncontrolled physical responses, all of the normal signs of a man at the absolute limit of endurance. He did not tell them anything useful. Okamoto wrote in one of his reports, recovered in 1946 and translated for the War Crimes Tribunal, a sentence that has been quoted in the limited historical literature that mentions Beecher at all. The subject appears to have constructed an internal architecture of silence that functions independently of physical state. This architecture has not been penetrated. The translation is slightly formal. The original Japanese conveys something closer to bewilderment. How does a man do that? How does a man in the water, lungs burning, body screaming, every biological imperative in his body urging him to speak, hold something behind locked doors inside his own mind? The answer is complicated. Habit is not one thing. Curtis Beecher had not been a particularly distinguished student at West Point, class of 1922. He graduated 87th in a class of 249, midway through the field, notable in signals and mathematics, and unremarkable in most other subjects. His fitness reports through the 1920s were consistently adequate and occasionally strong. He had no history of exceptional physical endurance. He was not, by any visible measure, the kind of man who would become a legend for suffering. What he had was something harder to quantify, a particular quality of stillness, which the people who knew him described in different terms. Patience, stubbornness, what his wife Eleanor called the long view. He had a deep conviction, formed partly by temperament and partly by a kind of military professionalism that the interwar army occasionally produced in men who thought seriously about their work, that there were things worth protecting at any cost. Not abstract things, specific things. And the names on that list, the men and women attached to those names, their lives. He also had Marcus Aurelius, which is not a trivial point. He had been reading the Meditations since his early 30s. He carried a copy, the translation by George Long, through 3 postings and 2 wars. The Stoic tradition that shaped Aurelius's worldview holds, at its core, at a single proposition that Beecher had spent a decade turning over in his mind, that the external world can take everything from you except the one thing that matters. The will, the internal disposition, the choice of how you respond to what happens to your body. Pain is external. What you do with pain is internal. This is, admittedly, easy to say. Much harder to perform in a darkened room on a wooden board while water fills your lungs. But Beecher had spent a long time preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Not water interrogation specifically, the broader experience of complete helplessness, of having everything external stripped away, of having nothing left but what was inside him. He had made his preparation methodically, the way he made all preparations, with the particular thoroughness of a signals officer who understands that redundant systems are the only reliable systems. He had decided, before he ever surrendered, what he would and would not say. He had made the decision in the abstract clearly, without adrenaline or fear clouding it. He had then rehearsed the decision so many times in his mind that it had become less a choice and more a structure, a fact of his internal landscape. He would not tell them about the cache. He would not tell them about the 14 agents. He would not tell them which codes had been broken. Everything else, the pain, the fear, yet the animal impulse to make it stop, was exterior noise. By the fifth week, Okamoto had extended the sessions and introduced additional methods. Electric current, stress positions combined with sleep deprivation of such duration that Beecher was, by medical standards, experiencing acute psychosis intermixed with periods of terrifying lucidity. He went days without food. He was moved to a smaller cell, essentially a cage, in a converted warehouse facility near Manila's port area. After the 3 American officers who had briefly shared the Kindley Field facility with Beecher would not see him again for months. When they finally encountered former POWs who had been held near Beecher's interrogation facility, the reports they assembled were fragmentary and incomplete. What they established from 4 separate witness accounts was this. Beecher was still alive at the 6-week mark. He was still being interrogated. He had not been cooperative. And he had, and at some point between the 4th and 6th weeks, reached some kind of inner equilibrium that his captors found deeply unsettling. One witness, a Filipino civilian laborer named Andres Macasat, who worked at the warehouse facility and later provided testimony to the war crimes tribunals, described Beecher during this period as not like a prisoner who had given up, but like a man who had arrived somewhere. This description, in translation, is slightly opaque. But what Macasat appeared to mean was that Beecher had passed through a stage of active resistance and suffering into something beyond it, a state in which the interrogation was happening to his body, and he was observing it from a distance, connected to it, but not identical to it. The medical literature on extreme torture and resistance has a term for something approximating this: dissociative resilience. It is not common, it is not easily explained, and it appears to be partly a neurological response to extreme sustained stress and partly a product of prior psychological preparation. The research on it, conducted largely through post-war interviews with survivors of extreme interrogation, suggests that a small subset of individuals, perhaps 3 to 5% by some estimates, possess an unusual capacity to remain cognitively functional and volitionally intact through physical suffering that would break most people within hours. And Beecher appears to have been one of these individuals. He would not have described it that way. He would have said, in the matter-of-fact manner he applied to most things, that he had made up his mind and then made it up again and again, each time the question came, and that was all there was to it. The interrogations entered their 9th week. Okamoto had, by this point, escalated through nearly every method at his disposal. Beecher had told him nothing. Yet the reports Okamoto filed with his superiors during this period reveal a man who was professionally frustrated and, underneath the formal language, genuinely perplexed. He had successfully extracted actionable intelligence from American officers of equivalent rank. Some had broken in hours. Others held out for days. Beecher was into his 3rd month. There were practical reasons for this beyond willpower alone. Beecher had compartmentalized his own knowledge deliberately, and during the weeks before the surrender, he had taken steps to limit what he personally knew, transferring certain operational details to subordinates he had instructed to destroy that information if captured. The interrogation was therefore, in one dimension, pursuing knowledge that Beecher genuinely did not possess in its most detailed form. He knew the outline. He knew the critical components. He did not know every name, every frequency, every specific operational protocol. What he knew, and what he was protecting absolutely, was the cache location, the 14 names, and the fact that the JN25 code had been compromised to a degree the Japanese had not yet determined. This last piece, the signals intelligence breakthrough, was the one that mattered most. If the Japanese confirmed that their naval code had been significantly broken, they would change it. If they changed it in time, the intelligence that enabled the American victory at Midway in June 1942 might have been unavailable. Midway destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and killed the best-trained naval aviators in the world. It changed the strategic geometry of the Pacific War in a single afternoon. Beecher did not know about Midway, of course. He was in a cage near Manila when those aircraft and those men went into the sea north of a small atoll. He would never know about it. He held anyway. He held because the principle was not contingent on outcomes he could see. The principle was simple: what he knew could get people killed. That was enough. On the 63rd day, something changed. The interrogations became less frequent. Okamoto was replaced by a different officer, a Captain Nishimura, who was younger and less experienced and who approached the sessions with what Makasayet described as less patience and more anger. This shift in interrogator was, paradoxically, easier for Beecher to manage. The rage in Nishimura's methods had a quality of desperation in it, a sense that the information was being demanded rather than extracted. Beecher had been managing Okamoto's cold professionalism for 2 months. Nishimura's fury was, comparatively, simple. The sessions became shorter. The intervals between them grew. Either the Japanese were shifting their resources, the American counteroffensive at Guadalcanal had begun in August, creating urgent new intelligence priorities across the entire theater, or they had concluded, at some level they could not formally acknowledge, that Beecher was not going to break. He was not going to break. This was, at this point, essentially a fact. What was breaking, quietly and with no single dramatic moment, was his body. The cumulative effect of 3 months of malnutrition, physical stress, deprivation, and repeated extreme physical trauma was progressing through Beecher's system with the patient efficiency of biology following its own protocols. He had entered captivity at a weight of roughly 161 pounds, already reduced from his pre-war 192 by 5 months of siege rations. By the end of August, witnesses who saw him during brief periods when prisoners were moved between facilities estimated his weight at perhaps 120 pounds. His cardiovascular system, subjected to the repeated extreme stress of the sessions, combined with inadequate nutrition, was failing. On the morning of August 29, 1942, Curtis Beecher did not wake up. He was found in his cell by a guard at 0630 hours. He was on his back, hands at his sides, the same battered copy of the Meditations open on the floor beside him, spine up, where it had apparently fallen from his hands. The Japanese medical officer who examined him listed the cause of death as cardiac failure, which was accurate in the narrow physiological sense, and completely inadequate as a description of what had actually happened. He was 43 years old. He had been in Japanese custody for 114 days. He had been under active interrogation for 90 of them. They never found the cache. They never found the 14 names. They never confirmed the extent of the JN-25 compromise. The news of Beecher's death did not reach American intelligence channels for months. At the Signal Intelligence Service, which by then had been reorganized into the nascent structure that would eventually become the National Security Agency, learned of his capture through intercepted communications and through agents still operating inside occupied Manila. The fact of his death was confirmed by a Filipino source in October 1942. The reaction within the small circle of people who understood what Beecher had been protecting was, by all surviving accounts, muted. Not because they did not understand what he had done, they understood completely. The muteness was the specific quality of grief that intelligence work produces. The grief of people who cannot discuss what they know, who cannot explain to anyone outside the circle why a specific man's death represents something beyond an ordinary military loss. They absorbed it and continued working. Major Ralph Schultz, who had delivered the envelope to Beecher's breakfast table 14 months earlier, wrote a single entry in his personal diary on the day the death was confirmed. The diary was declassified in 1995. The entry reads, in its entirety, word about Beecher, as expected, nothing more to say about it. This is not coldness. It is the compressed syntax of a man who has something very large to say and knows he cannot say it. In the weeks after Beecher's death, the interrogation of American Signal's intelligence personnel on Corregidor effectively ceased. Nishimura was transferred. The facility near Manila's port area was converted to other uses. The Japanese had concluded, through whatever calculus of cost and yield they applied to these decisions, that the remaining prisoners from the Corregidor signal section did not possess information of sufficient value to justify further intensive interrogation. They were correct. Beecher had been the one who knew. The 14 agents whose names were buried in the parapet rubble continued to operate. Some of them would be discovered and executed by the Japanese in 1943 and 1944 as the occupation tightened and the Kempeitai systematically dismantled the guerrilla and intelligence networks across Luzon. Others survived. Several of them were eventually contacted by American intelligence personnel who infiltrated the Philippines by submarine in 1943, operating under the Spiron program. They had been operating for more than a year in complete isolation, with no confirmation that anyone knew they existed. The cache was recovered in January 1945, 3 weeks after MacArthur's forces landed at Lingayen Gulf and began the liberation of Luzon. An Army Signal Corps officer named Lieutenant James Aldrich, working from a partial description preserved in a debriefing transcript from one of Beecher's subordinates, located the parapet section and after several days of careful excavation through rubble that had been shifted and resettled by 3 years of weather, found the tin box Beecher had buried. Inside it, 3 transmitter receivers, still serviceable after cleaning and minor repair. The folded sheet of paper, 14 names. Aldrich filed a report. The report went up the chain. It eventually reached the desk of someone at the Signal Intelligence Service who understood what they were looking at. There is no record of the specific reaction. There is only the report itself and a handwritten notation in the margin. The handwriting has never been definitively identified. That says simply, he knew. He kept it. The summer of 1942, during the 90 days Beecher spent in that facility, was one of the most consequential periods of the Pacific War. American naval cryptanalysts at Station HIPO in Pearl Harbor had broken enough of JN-25 to enable Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces for the Battle of Midway in June. The Japanese, unaware that their code was compromised, walked into a trap. 4 carriers, 322 aircraft, an estimated 3,407 men. In exchange, the United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 147 aircraft. Midway broke the offensive momentum of the Imperial Japanese Navy and did not give it back. The subsequent campaign at Guadalcanal, beginning in August, consolidated the strategic reversal. The shape of the war changed in those months. Had Beecher told Okamoto what he knew, the sequence of events might have been different. The Japanese might have changed JN-25 in time to deny Nimitz his intelligence advantage at Midway. They might not have. Counterfactual history is an uncertain business. But the possibility was real. The stakes were real. Beecher calculated them in his own way, without access to most of the specific intelligence that would make the calculation clear to historians later. He calculated them and arrived at an answer. No. That was his answer. Through 90 days and every method they applied to him. No. Eleanor Beecher received a telegram on March 15, 1943, informing her that her husband was missing in action, believed captured. So the Army's notification system moved slowly, and the intelligence channels through which his fate was actually known moved through different pipes entirely. She did not receive confirmation of his death until November 1943, 14 months after Beecher died in that cell. She lived in the house in San Francisco's Richmond district, where they had spent 3 years between his postings. She worked as a volunteer coordinator for the Red Cross. She wrote letters to the Army, to the War Department, to the State Department, methodical, precise letters in her firm school teacher handwriting, asking for any information about her husband's status. She received form responses. She kept writing. After the war, she was briefed by an Army intelligence officer on the general outlines of what her husband had done. The briefing was necessarily incomplete. The full scope of the signals intelligence operation he had been protecting remained classified. Yet the officer told her that her husband had protected information of critical importance under extreme duress, that his refusal to cooperate with the enemy had contributed materially to the war effort, and that the Army was grateful. She asked if he had suffered. The officer, to his considerable credit, told her the truth. She sat with that for a while. Then she asked whether the information he had protected had mattered, whether it had made a difference. The officer told her, truthfully, that it had made a very significant difference. She nodded. "Good," she said. "Then he would have thought it was worth it." She was probably right. She had known him for 20 years. The post-war reckoning with what happened at Corregidor and in the interrogation facilities around Manila took place on several levels simultaneously. The war crimes tribunals documented, in exhaustive detail, the systematic brutality of the Japanese treatment of prisoners throughout the Pacific Theater. General Masaharu Hama, who commanded the Japanese forces in the Philippines, was tried, convicted, and executed in April 1946 for his responsibility in the Bataan Death March and related atrocities. Others were tried at lower levels. Beecher's case was part of this record, documented in the tribunal evidence. His interrogation was cited as an example of the systematic use of torture against American prisoners, and the specific officers responsible, Okamoto and Nishimura, were identified in the evidence. Okamoto had died in the Philippines in 1944. American records do not specify the exact circumstances. Nishimura was tried for his role in prisoner mistreatment and sentenced to a prison term that was commuted as part of the general reduction in sentences that followed the Korean War and the 1951 peace treaty. He was released in 1953. He returned to Japan. Whatever he did with the rest of his life is not recorded in any source. This documentary has been able to locate. The 14 names on Beecher's list included 6 individuals who survived the occupation and provided extensive debriefing testimony to American intelligence after liberation. 2 of them had, independently, been aware of Beecher's capture and interrogation through the Filipino underground communication networks that continued operating throughout the occupation. At one of them, a man identified in documents only by his code name, Archangel, his real name remaining classified into the 1980s, had understood that the fact of his own survival was, in some direct sense, dependent on what Beecher was or was not telling his interrogators. He had lived for 3 years carrying that knowledge. He was debriefed in Manila in February 1945. The debriefing officer asked him if he had known Beecher personally. He said that he had met the colonel once, briefly, and at a meeting in Manila in September 1941. The debriefing officer asked if there was anything he wanted to say for the record. Archangel thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Tell his family he was reliable." In intelligence work, in the specific professional culture of men who live or die by other men's discretion and fortitude, there is no higher praise, reliable. It means when everything was against it, he kept his word. Beecher kept his word. To continue ready. The physical location where Beecher died was demolished in the general destruction of Manila that accompanied the Japanese evacuation and the American liberation of the city in February and March of 1945. The Battle of Manila was, by any measure, one of the most brutal urban engagements of the entire war. The Japanese, recognizing that the city was lost, conducted a systematic annihilation of its civilian population and its physical infrastructure that killed approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians. The warehouse district near the port area, where Beecher's interrogation facility had operated, was reduced to rubble. There was nothing to mark. The American military cemetery at Fort Bonifacio, south of Manila, contains the graves of 17,000 American servicemen. Curtis Beecher is not among them, and his body was never recovered. His death was confirmed through documentary evidence and witness testimony rather than physical remains. He is listed on the walls of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery, one of 36,000 names inscribed there, men whose bodies the sea or the jungle or the fire of those final months kept. His name is Panel F, column 26. The inscription lists his rank, his state, his branch. Nothing else. The wall of the missing does not explain. That it only remembers. Eleanor Beecher visited Manila in 1952 as part of one of the first civilian memorial pilgrimages organized after the peace treaty normalized relations with the Philippines. She found the wall. She found his name. She stood in front of it for approximately 20 minutes. According to the woman who accompanied her, a fellow Gold Star widow named Margaret Foss. She did not cry. She traced the letters with her fingertip. Then she stepped back and looked at the whole wall for a while. On the drive back to Manila, she said to Margaret Foss, "He would have hated having his name on a wall. He thought ceremonies were inefficient." She laughed when she said it. It was a real laugh, the laugh of a woman who has had 10 years to understand what she lost and has arrived at something on the other side of grief that resembles peace. She died in San Francisco in 1978. She never remarried. Says she kept the Marcus Aurelius. The Army had shipped back Beecher's personal effects, including the books that had been in his billet at Fort Stotzenberg before his transfer to Corregidor, on the nightstand for the rest of her life. The signals intelligence work that Beecher protected has, over the decades since, been the subject of considerable historical scholarship, most of which does not specifically name him. At the declassification of ultra and magic intelligence records beginning in the 1970s, opened the field substantially, and historians including John Prados, James Bamford, and Ronald Lewin produced detailed accounts of the cryptanalytic achievements of the Pacific War. The specific contribution of the Corregidor signals section, the intercepts gathered during the siege, the partial JN-25 breaks achieved in those terrible final months, is documented in the broader literature, though with varying specificity. What is clear from the declassified record is that the signals intelligence flow from the Philippines in the first months after Pearl Harbor provided American analysts at Station HIPO with critical context for their ongoing assault on JN-25. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Pearl Harbor were the ones who broke the code. Beecher's team was not responsible for that, but the traffic they intercepted, the patterns they documented, but the partial keys they developed during the siege, these contributed to Rochefort's work in ways that the declassified internal histories acknowledge. Had the Japanese, through a confession from Beecher, confirmed the extent of their communications compromise in the spring of 1942, the most likely outcome would have been an immediate change of the JN-25 system. Rochefort's team might have been unable to read the naval traffic that told them the Japanese target in the upcoming operation was designated AF, later confirmed as Midway. The trap that Nimitz set would not have been possible. The specific engagement that destroyed the Kido Butai, the elite Japanese carrier strike force, might not have occurred, or might have occurred on terms much less favorable to the Americans. The chain of consequence from a single man's silence runs through some of the largest events of the 20th century. This is almost never true of any individual's decision. Almost never. It is worth stopping here and sitting with a particular discomfort, because this story contains something that requires honest examination rather than simple celebration. The Signal Intelligence Service asked Curtis Beecher to do something that the Geneva Convention, which the United States nominally upheld, did not require of him. They asked him to protect information at any cost to himself. The law of war, as understood in 1942, required a prisoner to give only his name, rank, and serial number. It did not require him to endure torture. It did not require him to die. The architecture of protection built around prisoners of war was premised, explicitly, on the idea that information extracted by torture was both morally impermissible and practically unreliable, and that no soldier should be expected to hold out indefinitely against extreme coercion. The Signal Intelligence Service, in asking Beecher to protect signals intelligence secrets beyond the legal requirement, was asking something extraordinary. They did not frame it as an order. They could not have. They asked it essentially as a moral proposition, if captured, and understand what is at stake, and act accordingly. Beecher accepted this proposition fully and of his own free will, with complete understanding of what it might cost him. This does not make what was done to him acceptable. The Japanese officers who conducted his interrogation committed war crimes. The fact that Beecher chose to endure rather than cooperate does not diminish the criminality of the methods used against him. Both of these things are true at the same time. Yet what it does make Beecher, in the most specific and non-dramatic sense, is a man who understood the full terms of a bargain and paid them without complaint. The Stoic tradition he had been reading for a decade did not tell him suffering was good or desirable. It told him that suffering could be survived with integrity and tact, and that integrity, once compromised, could not be recovered. He held to that, all the way to the end. And the question of what Beecher experienced in the final weeks of his captivity, after the interrogations became less frequent, after Nishimura replaced Okamoto, after the Japanese shifted resources to Guadalcanal, is one that the documentary record cannot fully answer. The witnesses who saw him during this period describe a man who was physically diminished past any ordinary recognition, but who retained, in the accounts of multiple observers, some quality of interior composure that they struggled to characterize. Makasayat, the Filipino laborer who testified at the tribunals, said that in the last few weeks before Beecher's death, the colonel sometimes spoke to him in the brief moments when Makasayat was performing cleaning duties near his cell. The conversations were in English, which Makasayat spoke adequately, and were, by his account, entirely unremarkable. Beecher asked about the weather. He asked about Makasayat's family. He asked what news there was from the outside world, which Makasayat provided in carefully edited form, omitting anything that might get either of them in trouble. Once Makasayat said, Beecher asked him what month it was. When Makasayat told him it was late August, Beecher appeared to calculate something. He said, "Good." That was all. Just good. Makasayat didn't know what Beecher was calculating. He couldn't have known. But from the timeline, the Battle of Midway had been fought in early June. The landing at Guadalcanal had begun in early August. The strategic situation Beecher had been, in his own way, fighting to preserve, the signals intelligence advantage, the operational surprise it enabled, the broader momentum of American resistance, was, by late August, already bearing fruit in ways that were changing the direction of the war. He didn't know that. He couldn't have known that. He isolated in that cell with no access to reliable information about the outside world. But he may have been calculating that enough time had passed, that whatever window of maximum danger, the window in which his information, if extracted, could have been most damaging, had closed, that the architecture he had protected was either standing or it wasn't, and nothing more he did could change it. Good. The Army gave Beecher the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, but awarded in 1947 after the War Crimes Tribunal proceedings produced enough documentation to support a formal citation. The citation describes his extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, and specifically cites his refusal to provide military information to the enemy despite prolonged and severe treatment. It does not specify the nature of the information. It does not explain the signals intelligence context, but the citation is accurate as far as it goes, which is not nearly far enough. The Distinguished Service Cross is the second highest military decoration the United States Army awards, below only the Medal of Honor. There was a movement within the signals intelligence community, documented in internal memoranda from the late 1940s, to recommend Beecher for the Medal of Honor. Yet the recommendation ran into the fundamental problem of the signals intelligence world. The reasons for the award would have to be explained, and explaining them would require declassifying information that was still highly sensitive in 1947 and 1948, when the Cold War was already reshaping the intelligence architecture and protecting the methods and capabilities of American signals work remained a paramount concern. The Medal of Honor recommendation was not formally submitted. Yet the Distinguished Service Cross stood. This is one of those historical ironies that doesn't resolve into anything clean. The very secrecy that gave Beecher's sacrifice its meaning prevented that sacrifice from being fully recognized. The information he protected was too valuable to reveal even in his honor. He would not, one suspects, have found this ironic at all. he would have recognized it as entirely consistent with the terms of the work he had undertaken. Fort Stotzenberg, at where Beecher had lived in the bungalow where Schultz delivered the envelope, was destroyed in the liberation fighting of 1945. The base was rebuilt post-war and renamed Clark Air Base, which became one of the largest American air installations in the Pacific. It operated continuously until Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991 and buried much of the base under volcanic ash. The Americans evacuated. The base was returned to Philippine sovereignty. The ground where Beecher's bungalow had stood, though where he had read the directive that changed everything, is under a shopping mall now. The volcanic ash was cleared. The land was developed. The ordinary machinery of time and commerce transformed the landscape beyond recognition. This happens everywhere that history occurred. It is not a comment on anything except the nature of time. The Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor still exists. The island is now a national shrine and tourist destination, accessible by ferry from Bataan, and the tunnel has been partially restored and features a light and sound show recounting the siege. Thousands of visitors walk through it every year. Few of them have heard of Curtis Beecher. The histories of Corregidor naturally emphasize the more famous figures: General Jonathan Wainwright, who commanded the defense; the nursing corps, who remained to care for the wounded; the men who chose to die fighting rather than surrender. Beecher's story is marginal to all of those narratives, filed in a separate drawer labeled Signals Intelligence, and largely left there. This is not unusual. The history of intelligence work is, almost by definition, a history of marginalization and omission. The people who do this work understand, when they begin it, that the nature of their contribution means it cannot be fully acknowledged. Beecher understood this better than most. There is a moment that in the understanding of any historical figure who died before they could speak for themselves, when the historian has to be honest about the limits of what can be known. Beecher's internal experience during those 90 days is not recoverable. The words on the page of the meditations he was reading when he died, we don't know. The last conscious thought he had, we don't know. Whether he knew he was dying, or whether it came as a cardiac arrest, does in many cases, without warning, that while he was simply reading in the pre-dawn quiet, we don't know. What we know is what the record shows. A man who made a decision, held to it past all expectation and all physical limit, and did not break. The Japanese professionals who interrogated him, men with extensive experience, extracting information from unwilling subjects, could not break him. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The Stoic Emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose book Beecher carried for the last months of his life, wrote in Book 6 of the Meditations, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is the Stoic understanding of obstacle and resistance, that the thing opposing you is not separate from the path forward, but is itself the path, if you can endure it long enough and with sufficient clarity of purpose. Beecher did not quote Aurelius to anyone, as far as the record shows. He was not given to self-dramatization or philosophical proclamation, but the architecture of the Meditations, the proposition that external circumstances cannot determine internal disposition, that the self is a citadel whose gates only open from the inside, runs through what he did so completely that it is impossible to separate them. He built a citadel, he held it, he died holding it. The signals intelligence work that defined the Pacific War's cryptanalytic dimension has, over the past 80 years, been recognized as one of the most consequential intelligence operations in military history. The names most associated with it, Rochefort, Layton, Nimitz, the brilliant analysts at Station HIPO, are documented in substantial historical literature. The books are written, the films have been made. The contributions are, at this point, widely understood by anyone with serious interest in the Pacific War. Beecher's name appears in approximately 3 documents available to the general public. A citation in the post-war Army records, partially redacted. A name on a wall in Manila. A single paragraph in an internal signal intelligence service history that was declassified in 1998 and has been read, by most estimates, by a few hundred people. The disproportion between the significance of what he did and the visibility of its recognition is stark. It is also, in one sense, exactly right. Yet the work he did required invisibility. His silence was the point. A man who would have done this work only if he could be famous for it would not have been the right man for the work. Beecher was the right man precisely because he understood that his contribution would disappear into the machinery of an operation much larger than himself, that the effects would be distributed through events he would never know about, yet that his name would be a footnote in documents that would sit in drawers for decades. He did it anyway. The aftermath of the Philippine campaign shaped American military doctrine in ways that are still visible. The catastrophic losses of 1941 and 1942 drove a thorough restructuring of how the Army and Navy conceptualized intelligence operations in contested and potentially captured territories. Protocols were developed for the staged destruction of sensitive materials. A compartmentalization, the practice of limiting any individual's knowledge of the full scope of an operation to the minimum required for their function, was formalized and enforced more rigorously. The principle, implicit in what Beecher had done instinctively, that no single individual should hold more information than they absolutely needed, became explicit doctrine. At the interrogation resistance training that became standard for American service personnel, and which today is institutionalized in the SERI program, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, draws on the documented experiences of Pacific War prisoners, including the records of Corregidor. The resistance techniques that Beecher employed, not formally or by training, but through a combination of temperament, preparation, and philosophy. It anticipated by decades the systematic thinking about interrogation resistance that American military psychology would eventually develop. He was, in this sense, a prototype, a man who worked out independently, under the worst possible conditions, a method of resistance that would later be studied, codified, and taught to thousands of American service personnel as part of formal military education. He never knew he was prototyping anything. He was just doing what he had decided to do. Yet the broader story of signals intelligence in the Pacific War carries a specific kind of moral complexity that deserves acknowledgement here. The ability to read the enemy's communications, a capability maintained, in significant part, by the silence of men like Beecher, enabled American commanders to make decisions that saved tens of thousands of American lives. Midway specifically, the campaign in the Solomon Islands, the later operations in the Central Pacific. Yet the interception and destruction of Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft in April 1943, which removed the architect of Pearl Harbor from the war. But the same intelligence advantage, applied to the submarine war against Japanese shipping, contributed to the near-total destruction of Japan's merchant marine, which contributed to the starvation and privation of the Japanese civilian population as the war entered its final phase. Intelligence is not morally neutral, and the uses to which it is put carry moral weight, and the consequences of its use extend through chains of consequence that no individual actor can fully trace or fully claim responsibility for. Beecher was not responsible for the uses of the intelligence advantage he helped preserve. He was responsible for the decision to preserve it, at the cost he paid. The distinction matters, though it doesn't simplify anything. What simplifies, in the end, is just the fact itself. And a man was asked to hold something. He held it. Everything else, the strategic consequences, the historical weight, the moral complexity, flows from that single fact and ramifies outward into the world in ways that can be traced but not contained. In January 1945, when Lieutenant Aldrich found the tin box in the parapet rubble on Corregidor, he opened it carefully. He inventoried the contents. He cleaned the transmitter receivers and tested them. They worked, after some coaxing. He unfolded the sheet of paper and read the 14 names and the partial cipher key and the brief operational notes that Beecher had written in his precise signals officer's hand in the last hours before the surrender. The paper was yellowed and slightly water-damaged at one corner, but entirely legible. The handwriting was clear. Aldrich filed his report. The report moved up the chain. Somewhere in the Signal Intelligence Service, a senior officer who had known about the Corregidor operation since 1941 read the report and understood what he was reading. Understood that this piece of paper, in this tin box, buried under 3 years of rubble, represented the last act of a man who had died in a cell 800 miles away, having said nothing that would have told anyone where to look. There is no record of what that officer said or did when he finished reading the report. The bureaucratic machinery moved on. At the tin box was cataloged, its contents processed, the 14 names cross-referenced against current intelligence. The operational residue of the dead was folded back into the living work. Time moves in one direction. The work continues. When the ferry from Bataan approaches Corregidor on a clear morning, the island resolves out of the haze as a shape at once solid and spectral, a dark mass riding the green water of Manila Bay, the ruins of the batteries visible on the upper slopes, at the white lighthouse catching the early light. The tourists taking the tour know, in general, what happened there. The battle, the surrender, the suffering that the word Bataan has come to carry in American historical memory. Most of them do not know about the tunnel lateral 60 meters from the east entrance where 4 men worked 2 shifts, around the clock, under shell fire, listening to Japanese communications through headphones while the rock shook around them. Most of them do not know about the tin box in the parapet. Most of them do not know the name Curtis Beecher. This is not a complaint. It is an observation. The history of any large event is the history of aggregated individual actions, most of which are never named. The named history, the generals, the battles, the turning points, is the visible surface of an ocean whose depth is the unrecorded effort of the nameless and the nearly nameless. Beecher is nearly nameless. He belongs to the depth, but he was there. He made his decisions. He paid his price. He held. That is enough to say. Maybe it is everything to say. The Marcus Aurelius that Eleanor Beecher kept on her nightstand in San Francisco was the long translation, a Victorian rendering of the Greek original, that has since been largely supplanted by more recent and more accurate versions. It is not the best translation, but it was Beecher's translation, at the one he had read and annotated and carried through 3 postings in a war and into a cell he didn't leave. The annotations, by all accounts, are minimal. Underlines in pencil, occasionally a marginal mark that seems to indicate agreement or significance. Only once, in Book 2, is there a written marginal note. The note is in Beecher's hand, the same precise signals officer's hand that wrote the 14 names on the paper in the tin box. And it is 3 words. And those 3 words are, yes, this, exactly. Book 2, the passage marked, is the one that begins with the observation that a man who has lived fully for a single day has seen everything there is to see. That a life is not measured in its length, but in the completeness with which it was inhabited. That a man who has been fully present to his purpose, who has acted according to his deepest understanding of what is right, has not been diminished by a short life or a difficult one. Yes, this, exactly. He wrote that at some point before the surrender, before the cell, before the 90 days. He wrote it in ordinary time, a man reading a book on a Tuesday or a Thursday, annotating a passage that resonated. He then went and proved it. Immediate aftermath. The day after Curtis Beecher died in his cell, the guard who found him reported the death up the Japanese chain of command. An intelligence officer reviewed the file and noted that the subject had provided no actionable intelligence during 90 days of intensive interrogation. The file was closed. There were no further resources allocated to the case. The port area facility continued its other operations. Beecher's body was interred in a temporary gravesite in Manila, the location of which was not recorded with sufficient precision to enable post-war recovery. Major Okamoto, who had conducted the primary interrogation, had already been transferred to other duties. He filed no retrospective analysis of the case. The Imperial Army's intelligence bureaucracy moved on to the urgent demands of a war that was beginning, in the second half of 1942, to turn against Japan in ways that required all available attention. In Pearl Harbor, the analysts at Station Haipio continued breaking JN-25. They did not know the name of the man who had helped preserve their advantage. Yet they did not know and could not know the specific cost at which that preservation had been purchased. Protagonist's fate. Curtis Beecher's fate was complete by August 29, 1942. He was 43 years old. He had served the United States Army for 20 years. He had been married 16 years to a woman he loved with the quiet thoroughness he applied to everything. He had never had children. This was a sorrow that Eleanor mentioned once in a letter to her sister that has survived in a private family collection. He had spent his career doing careful, technical, largely invisible work that he believed mattered, and it had. He died in occupied Manila, physically destroyed by 3 months of systematic torture, his mind intact, the meditations at his side, the cash in the rubble, the 14 names protected, his body lost to the fires that consumed the city, his name on a wall. He spoke about his work to no one, and which was the professional requirement and also the personal disposition of a man who had decided what mattered and had no need to explain it. He is not widely remembered. He was not widely known. He was exactly what the Signal Intelligence Service needed him to be: reliable. Historical legacy. The cryptanalytic achievements of the Pacific War are now well documented and widely recognized as a pivotal factor in the Allied victory. Yet the intelligence advantage that American signals work provided, the ability to read Japanese naval and army communications at critical junctures, shortened the war and saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. The Battle of Midway, enabled in critical part by signals intelligence, is the clearest single example, but it is one of dozens. The men and women who made this possible, the analysts, the code breakers, the intercept operators, except the people who built and maintained the network, worked in obscurity that was not merely circumstantial but deliberate. The secrecy that protected the signal's intelligence advantage required that its practitioners remain invisible. Many of them spent the rest of their lives unable to explain to their families or their communities what they had actually done in the war. Beecher's contribution fits this pattern, yet except that his contribution included something that most signals intelligence personnel were not asked for: his body. He gave not just his professional skill and his discretion, but his physical endurance and ultimately his life to protect what he knew. He represents the far end of a spectrum of sacrifice that the signals intelligence community required of its members, a spectrum that mostly remained within the realm of professional secrecy and career limitation and occasionally extended, at an extreme circumstances, to this. The protocols developed in response to the Philippine campaign experience, the compartmentalization, the staged destruction procedures, the interrogation resistance frameworks, influenced American intelligence doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. The SERI program, which has trained hundreds of thousands of American military personnel in survival and resistance since its formalization in the 1950s, carries in its resistance to interrogation component and the distilled lessons of experiences like Beecher's. His name is not mentioned. The lesson is: the signals intelligence history of the Pacific War was formally acknowledged when Ultra and Magic records began declassification in the 1970s. The NSA, successor to the Signal Intelligence Service, maintains historical records and has produced internal histories that document the Corregidor operation in varying levels of detail. A full, publicly available history of the operation and of Beecher's specific role has not been written. The record is scattered across declassified documents, tribunal transcripts, and the brief paragraph in the 1998 internal history. This documentary represents one effort to assemble those fragments into a coherent account. It is necessarily incomplete. The most sensitive details remain, in some cases, classified, or simply unrecoverable. History has edges, and this one has more edges than most. Final reflection. On the morning of August 29, 1942, a man died in a cell in Manila holding something that he had decided mattered more than anything that could be done to him. He had decided this in advance, clearly, without the distorting pressure of the moment, and then he had honored his decision through 90 days of conditions designed specifically to make that honoring impossible. Yet the information he protected contributed to a chain of events that shaped the Pacific War in ways that cannot be precisely quantified, but can be reasonably traced. The 14 people whose names he carried did not die because of him. The code advantage he helped preserve held long enough to matter, at Midway and afterward. The work continued. He was 43 years old. He read Marcus Aurelius. He had a wife who wore a yellow dress and waved once from a dock and understood, shut without being told, what kind of man she had married. He kept his word. The wall in Manila carries his name. The rest is what it always is. The unwitnessed interior of a man who made his choice and kept it, in the dark, alone, without the comfort of witnesses, or recognition, or the knowledge that it had mattered. It mattered. Call to action. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Say subscribe for more forgotten stories from the margins of history, the ones that changed everything without anyone knowing their names. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These stories deserve to be remembered. Script complete. Visuals. 1. Wide establishing shot of Manila Bay at dawn. Corregidor Island visible as a dark silhouette against the pale gold horizon. Morning mist rising from the water's surface. And the island's rugged terrain and bomb-scarred concrete fortifications barely discernible in the early light. Muted blues and grays transitioning to faint amber. 1942 Pacific Theater atmosphere. Cinematic and somber. 2. Close-up interior of a military interrogation room in a converted Manila warehouse. Circa 1942. Bare concrete walls with water stains and peeling paint. A single incandescent bulb hanging from the ceiling. A wooden chair centered under the harsh light, and a Japanese officer's cap resting on a battered wooden table in the foreground. Deep shadows filling the corners, warm yellowed light creating high contrast against the dark perimeter. Photorealistic historical detail. 3. Close-up detail of weathered hands on an open book, the pages of a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Edges browned and one corner water-damaged. Pencil annotations visible in a precise military script in the margins. The words, yes, this, exactly. Faintly legible in close focus, warm lantern light from the right. The texture of aging paper and faded ink rendered in precise detail, intimate and quietly powerful. Script complete. The world Beecher left behind. There is a particular kind of soldier that the interwar United States Army produced in larger numbers than it is usually given credit for. The technically minded professional who understood, with unusual clarity, and that the next war would be decided not purely by firepower and manpower, but by information, by the ability to know what the enemy intended before he acted, by the capacity to move inside his decision cycle, as later theorists would put it, to be 3 steps ahead in the cognitive dimension of warfare while remaining competitive in the physical one. Beecher was one of these men. He had understood it early, which is to say, bound at a time when such understanding was professionally unfashionable and sometimes actively discouraged. The American Army of the 1920s and 1930s was an institution shaped by the traumatic experience of the Western Front and the subsequent conviction that a democratic republic should maintain only the most minimal standing military force necessary for national defense. The Army was small, chronically underfunded, and operationally focused on the conventional dimensions of warfare. Intelligence, and signals intelligence in particular, occupied a marginal position in the institutional hierarchy. The men who believed in it anyway, who studied it, cultivated it, argued for it in the face of institutional indifference, were a specific type. They tended to be technically competent rather than politically adept. They tended to be patient. They tended to think in systems rather than in individual engagements. They were, in the terminology of the moment, details men, which was not always meant as a compliment. Beecher had been called a details man by a superior officer who meant it disparagingly in a 1935 fitness report that noted his tendency to overinvest in technical minutiae at the expense of broader strategic vision. The officer who wrote this was almost certainly describing, without recognizing it, the precise quality that would make Beecher essential in the Philippines 7 years later. You cannot run a signals intercept network, maintain the security of a distributed agent operation, and protect classified information under torture without an exceptional capacity to hold complex technical detail clearly in your mind. Beecher's tendency to overinvest in technical minutiae was not a professional flaw. It was a professional superpower. He was also, as several colleagues from the interwar period recalled in post-war interviews, a man who thought carefully about the ethics of his work. Not in the self-congratulatory fashions of men who enjoy thinking about ethics without committing to its demands. In the quiet, persistent fashion of a man who has arrived at clear positions through genuine reflection and intends to act on them. The position he had arrived at, visible in retrospect through his choices, was something like this. The people under his responsibility were not instruments. They were ends in themselves. And the 14 agents on his list were not assets to be burned when the operational calculus required it. They were people, Filipino and American, who had trusted the network he built with their lives. The obligation ran the other direction, as far as he was concerned. He owed them protection, and the protection he could provide, at the moment of the surrender, was his silence. The signals world of 1942. To appreciate what Beecher was protecting, and it helps to understand the state of signals intelligence in the Pacific in early 1942, not in abstract terms, but in the concrete, operational terms that shaped his daily work in the Malinta Tunnel lateral. The Japanese Navy used several primary cipher systems. The most important, for American intelligence purposes, was JN-25, a complex system combining a codebook of approximately 33,000 five-digit code groups with an additive cipher table that encrypted the codebook values. But breaking JN-25 required two simultaneous efforts: recovering the codebook values and stripping the additive cipher. Neither was simple. Both required enormous quantities of intercepted traffic, careful statistical analysis, and the accumulated expertise of analysts who had been studying the system for years. Had the American signals intelligence effort against Japanese communications dated formally to the creation of OP-20G in the Navy and the Signal Intelligence Service in the Army during the late 1920s and 1930s. By 1941, these organizations had made significant progress against several Japanese systems, including the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Type B cipher machine, dubbed Purple by the Americans, which they had reconstructed mechanically from pure cryptanalysis. And without ever seeing the actual machine, this was one of the most impressive technical achievements in the history of cryptology. JN-25 was harder. It had been revised repeatedly, and each revision set the analytical process back. The version in use at the time of Pearl Harbor, JN-25B, had been introduced in December 1940, giving the Americans only a year to attack it before the war began. Progress had been made, but was incomplete. The analysts at Station Hipo in Pearl Harbor, a station cast in the Philippines, and Station Belconnen in Melbourne were all working the problem simultaneously, sharing partial recoveries and coordinating their analytical efforts across thousands of miles. Station Cast was Beecher's sister operation, the Navy's Signals Intelligence Facility in the Philippines, located at Cavite Naval Station south of Manila. When Cavite was bombed and destroyed in the first days of the war, and the cast personnel moved to Corregidor and eventually evacuated by submarine in early 1942, taking their most sensitive materials with them. The evacuation was successful. The continuity of the Navy's signals intelligence effort was largely preserved. The Army's operation, Beecher's operation was different. The Army signals section was smaller, less well-resourced, and more deeply integrated into the overall communications structure of the Philippine Command. And it could not be evacuated in the same way. It had to stay and fight, gathering intelligence until the last possible moment, and then destroy what it knew and surrender with whatever remained. What Beecher's section had accumulated during the siege was, in the intelligence assessment of the post-war historians, who had access to the full record, a body of intercept material that confirmed and extended the Navy's JN-25 analysis in several specific areas. But the Army's intercept responsibilities covered Japanese Army and logistics communications, rather than naval operational traffic, but the traffic they monitored touched the naval operational picture indirectly in ways that provided context and corroboration for the Navy's analytical work. The most sensitive piece was the one Beecher had protected absolutely: the confirmation that the Army section had successfully identified and was exploiting a specific weakness in the JN-25 additive system. That this was a technical detail that, if known to Japanese counterintelligence, would have triggered an immediate revision of the additive tables, rendering months of painstaking analytical work worthless. The timing, spring and early summer of 1942, when Rochefort's team was racing to identify the target of the Japanese summer offensive, made this particular secret extraordinarily valuable. Losing it at that moment would have been, as the subsequent history makes clear, catastrophic. Yet Beecher did not know the full analytical picture at Station Hypo. He did not know what Rochefort was working on. Compartmentalization meant he understood his own piece of the operation clearly, and the broader picture only in outline. What he knew, in outline, was enough. The signal's intelligence advantage was real, it was fragile, and it depended on Japanese ignorance of how much had been broken. Confirming that ignorance required his silence. The nature of the resistance. The human capacity to resist compelled disclosure under extreme physical duress has been the subject of both practical study and philosophical reflection for as long as states have had secrets worth protecting and enemies willing to use torture to extract them. The ancient world produced examples on multiple sides of this equation: torturers who were confident in their methods and individuals whose resistance puzzled and frustrated them. Yet the modern study of interrogation resistance was shaped, in significant part, by the experiences of American, British, and other Allied prisoners during World War II and the subsequent Korean War. The Korean War experience, which produced a number of American prisoners who made public statements and confessions under North Korean and Chinese pressure, prompted the United States military to develop systematic resistance training. The resulting SERI program, and the broader body of psychological research it generated, identified several factors that distinguished prisoners who maintained resistance from those who cooperated. Prior decision-making was the most consistent predictor. Prisoners who had thought carefully, in advance, about what they would and would not disclose, who had made clear internal commitments to specific boundaries, showed significantly greater resistance than those who had not. And this is counterintuitive in one sense. You might expect that a person subjected to extreme pain would abandon prior decisions in the immediate urgency of the moment, that the abstract commitment would dissolve in the concrete extremity. What the research found was the opposite. The prior decision, if made with sufficient clarity and conviction, actually restructured the subsequent experience. It was not that the committed individual felt less pain, and it was that the pain was processed differently, as something happening to the exterior against an interior that had already settled the question. Beecher's behavior under interrogation matches this pattern precisely. In Okamoto's frustrated reports, subject appears to have constructed an internal architecture of silence that functions independently of physical state. Are essentially a Japanese intelligence officer's formulation of what the SERI researchers would eventually describe in more systematic terms. The architecture had been built in advance. The sessions could damage the building but could not reach the foundation. And the second factor identified in the resistance research was social commitment, the specific knowledge that other people's lives depended on the information being protected. Abstract loyalty to a cause or a nation showed lower predictive power than concrete commitment to specific named individuals. The prisoner who was protecting a code was more susceptible than the prisoner who was protecting people. But this finding is grim in one sense. It suggests that torture is more effective against ideological commitment than against personal loyalty. But it also explains something about Beecher. He was not protecting an abstract principle. He was protecting 14 people by name. He knew their names. He had, in at least some cases, met them. They were real to him in the most specific possible way. The third factor was philosophical preparation. Not specific training, but a prior intellectual framework for understanding the relationship between the body's experience and the self's identity. Religious faith was one such framework. Philosophical stoicism was another. The common element was a conviction, worked out in advance and held with genuine depth, that the suffering body was not the whole self, that what the body said or did under compulsion was not what the self had chosen, that identity and dignity were not located in the physical. Beecher had all three. He had made his decision clearly. He was protecting specific people. He had a philosophical framework that he had spent years internalizing. These were not lucky accidents. He had built them deliberately, the way a signals officer builds a redundant communications network, because he understood that the most important systems need backup capacity, and the most important system of all was the one inside his own skull. At the long occupation. While Beecher endured his interrogation in the port area facility, the broader Philippine landscape was being transformed by the machinery of Japanese occupation. The 14th Army had taken Manila in January 1942, and by May, the entire archipelago was under Japanese control. What followed was one of the most brutal occupations in the history of the Pacific War, a systematic exploitation of the Filipino population's labor and resources, enforced by the captivity and the military police, with a violence that did not differentiate clearly between genuine resistance and ordinary civilian behavior. For the 14 people on Beecher's list, the occupation meant 3 years of extraordinary danger. They were intelligence assets in place, which meant they had been recruited before the fall to observe Japanese military activities, collect information, and eventually must pass that information to American forces when contact could be reestablished. During the period of Beecher's captivity, they were operating in complete isolation. No communication in, no communication out. No way of knowing whether the network they had joined still existed, whether the Americans were coming back, whether the risk they were running had any purpose. Several of them operated through the Filipino underground, but the informal resistance networks that sustained themselves throughout the occupation through combinations of social connection, family loyalty, and extraordinary courage. The underground operated bakeries and small shops as cover. It passed messages through market women and priests and school teachers. It maintained, at enormous personal risk, and a tenuous communication infrastructure that provided the foundation for the more formal resistance networks that American submarines would eventually resupply beginning in 1943. The Japanese captivity was reasonably effective at identifying and dismantling resistance networks. Their methods were consistent: surveillance, informants, capture, torture, execution. Now, 3 of the 14 individuals on Beecher's list were killed by the captivity during the occupation, 2 in 1943 and 1 in late 1944, as the Japanese tightened their grip in anticipation of the American return. Their deaths were not caused by any information provided by Beecher, which is to say, his silence protected the 11 who survived, and whatever factors led to the deaths of the 3 who did not, it was not his failure. This is a distinction that matters, although it does not entirely comfort. The occupation was lethal regardless. The question was always what could be protected and what could not. Beecher protected what he could protect, and 11 out of 14 survived, a rate of survival that, given the conditions of the occupation, represents something close to a miracle of operational security. The army that did not relieve them, The men and women who fought and suffered and died in the Philippine campaign in 1941 and 1942 understood, and at some point that varied by individual, but that came to everyone eventually, that relief was not coming. This understanding arrived differently for different people. For some, it was a slow erosion of hope, as weeks became months, and the radio brought no news of ships assembling in Hawaii. For others, it was a sudden, sharp clarity, a moment of looking at the arithmetic of the situation and reaching an inescapable conclusion. For Beecher, working in the signals section, had the understanding arrived earlier than for most. He was reading the traffic. He knew what was moving and what was not. He understood by January 1942 that the strategic situation precluded significant relief, that the losses at Pearl Harbor, combined with the demands of the European theater and the fundamental logistical constraints of projecting force across the Pacific, made any meaningful reinforcement of the Philippine garrison essentially impossible for the foreseeable future. But he kept working anyway. This is perhaps the most precise statement of his character that the record allows. He understood the situation clearly, without illusions, and kept working because the work was worth doing regardless of whether it would be rewarded, regardless of whether anyone would come. He was doing what he had been sent to do, and he would do it until he could not. The moral tradition he had been reading called this precisely doing one's duty without attachment to the outcome, not because the outcome didn't matter, but because the doing was not contingent on the outcome. You did what was right because it was right, not because it would succeed. MacArthur left Corregidor on March 11, 1942, evacuated by PT boat on the orders of President Roosevelt, accompanied by his wife, his small son, and a party of 17 staff officers. He left behind 10,000 men who would fight for another 2 months, and then surrender. He gave no speech as he left. He departed at night, but in secret. On arriving in Australia, he made his famous declaration, "I came through and I shall return." The men he left behind were not consulted on this promise. Beecher, had he been asked, would probably have had no comment. He was not a man who expressed resentment about things he couldn't change. He understood the strategic rationale for preserving MacArthur, keeping the most senior American commander in the Pacific alive and operational, was, from a certain vantage point, at the reasonable military decision. He would have analyzed it and filed it and gotten back to work. What he would have felt about it, whether there was anger underneath the professional acceptance, is not recorded. He had, as established, a limited practice of expressing his interior state to anyone. He simply went on. The specific gravity of secrecy. There is a particular weight that classified knowledge carries that is different from other kinds of burdens. It is not merely the weight of the information itself, the technical details, the names, the operational specifics, but the weight of not being able to share it. Most human distress can be lightened, at least partially, through communication. Talking about suffering does not eliminate it, but it distributes it, allows it to be witnessed and therefore validated, gives it a social context that makes it endurable. The intelligence professional is specifically denied this. Yet the burden must be carried alone, without distribution, without the psychological relief of acknowledgement. This is true in peacetime, when the secrecy is largely bureaucratic and the daily cost relatively low. It becomes acutely true under the conditions Beecher was living: 5 months of siege, then captivity, then systematic torture, when the psychological resources available to endure the burden are already depleted by physical and emotional extremity. Men in these circumstances sometimes develop elaborate internal narratives to make the silence bearable. They become the keeper of the secret, the guardian, the last man standing. The narrative provides meaning that external circumstances cannot. It transforms passive suffering into active purpose. I am not simply being hurt. I am protecting something. The hurt has a direction. It is aimed at something. Beecher may have maintained something like this. The evidence is indirect and partial. But his behavior under interrogation, the specific quality of endurance that Okamoto described as an internal architecture of silence, suggests an active rather than passive resistance. He was not simply failing to speak. He was choosing not to speak repeatedly in each session, each time the question came. The distinction matters. Failure is passive. Choice is active. Choice can be sustained in a way that failure cannot, because choice draws on purpose, and purpose is renewable in a way that mere endurance is not. He chose each time. That is the simplest and most complete description of what he did. After the liberation. When American forces landed at Lingayen Gulf on January 9, 1945, and began the grinding 60-mile drive south toward Manila, the intelligence officers who accompanied the advancing columns had specific assignments. Among them, locate and assess the survival of pre-invasion intelligence networks and their assets. Determine which of the agents placed before the occupation were still alive and operational. Re-establish contact. Debrief. The process took months. The liberation of Manila itself, which began in early February and lasted until early March, was a catastrophe of destruction that complicated everything. The Japanese had issued orders that no prisoners would survive the occupation, an order that was carried out with varying thoroughness depending on the specific unit, the specific commander, and the specific circumstances. At Palawan, 140 American POWs had been burned alive by their captors in December 1944. At the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila, negotiations during the battle produced a more complex outcome. At Bilibid prison, us prisoners were left largely intact when the Japanese abandoned the facility. The intelligence officers working through the rubble of Manila in February and March of 1945 were navigating all of this simultaneously. They were also trying to reconstruct the pre-invasion intelligence picture. What had been placed, what had survived, what could be recovered. Beecher's network occupied a specific set of files. The personnel who had run the Corregidor signals section, and those who had survived captivity and could be interviewed, provided what they knew of the operation's scope. One of Beecher's subordinates, a Captain Thomas Villanueva, who had been held at Cabanatuan POW camp through the occupation and liberated in the famous raid of January 1945, provided the partial description of the cache location that Aldrich eventually used. Villanueva had been present at the signals section through the final weeks of the siege and had seen Beecher working but had not been told the specific location of the cache. What he knew was the approximate section of the parapet wall, the type of container used, and the approximate depth of the burial. It was enough. Aldrich spent several days on Corregidor, working with Filipino laborers to clear rubble from the indicated section of the fortifications. Yet the island was by then a ghost. The garrison that had held it so long gone, the structures smashed, the jungle beginning its slow reclamation of the concrete. The liberation fighting had added additional destruction to what the Japanese siege had done. The parapet section Aldrich was working with had been further buried by debris from a collapsed wall nearby. He found the box on the fourth day, approximately 37 inches below the surface, and in a niche that Beecher had excavated with a folding entrenching tool in the pre-dawn darkness of May 6, 1942. The tool was still there, buried separately, 2 feet away. Beecher had thought of everything. The people who remembered. The veterans of the Philippine campaign, those who survived the death march, the prison camps, the hellship transports to Japan, the labor details and the privations, and the casual brutality of 3 years of occupation, came home to a country that was, yet by the time they arrived, focused on celebrating victory and getting back to normal. The atomic bombs fell in August 1945. The Japanese surrendered on September 2nd. By November, the demobilization was moving at a pace that the military infrastructure could barely manage. Millions of men were trying to get home at once. The Philippine veterans came back to a somewhat different reception than those who had fought in Europe or in the Central Pacific campaigns that captured the public imagination. Yet their war had been, from the American perspective, a long defeat followed by liberation. The public memory of Bataan and Corregidor was shaped by the death march and the prison camp atrocities. Genuine horrors that the veterans carried back in their bodies and their nightmares, and not primarily by the accomplishments of the men who had fought there. The accomplishments were real. The defense of Bataan and Corregidor had tied down substantial Japanese forces for months, disrupted the Japanese operational timeline in the Philippines, and demonstrated that American and Filipino soldiers could fight effectively against a skilled and aggressive enemy under impossible conditions. This mattered. The history acknowledges it, though not always with the emphasis it deserves. The signals intelligence community's veterans came back with an additional layer of complexity. They couldn't explain what they had done. The work remained classified. Yet they carried their specific contributions in silence, unable to explain them to families who wondered why the war had taken so long, to journalists who wanted stories, to veterans groups where the social currency was shared experience. The signals officer who had spent 2 years listening to Japanese communications through headphones could not, at a Veterans Association dinner, explain how his work had contributed to Midway or Guadalcanal. He could not answer the question, "What did you do in the war?" with anything except a vague description of communications work that satisfied nobody. Some of them eventually talked, after the declassifications of the 1970s. Some of them died with it. The veterans of the Corregidor Signals section were a small group. Most of them survived the war, having been transferred to other postings after their release from captivity or their evacuation before the fall, and several provided testimony at the war crimes tribunals. A few wrote brief, unpublished memoirs that ended up in university archives. They remembered Beecher with the specific regard of professional admiration. The man in the group who had stayed when others left, who had held what needed holding, who had not come back. Captain Villanueva, who spent 3.5 years in Cabanatuan and returned to the Philippines after the war to teach secondary school in Pampanga province, gave a single interview in 1981 to a historian working on the Corregidor campaign. He was asked if he had ever talked about Beecher publicly. He said he had mentioned him occasionally when speaking to students about the war, in general terms. He was asked what he said. "I tell them there was a man who decided what mattered," Villanueva said, "and then he made sure it mattered, and that is all there is to say about him." The wall says his name. The Manila American Cemetery and Memorial covers 152 acres in the Fort Bonifacio district of Manila on a gentle rise south of the city. It is the largest American military cemetery outside the United States. Its circular memorial building stands at the crest of the site, and from its interior, the great mosaic map traces the Pacific campaigns in ceramic tiles that glow amber and gold in the light from the clerestory windows. But outside, the curving walls of the memorial carry the names of 36,000 missing, men whose remains were never recovered, whose bodies the ocean or the jungle or the fire kept. The wall of the missing faces east, toward the Pacific that claimed so many of those 36,000. Panel F, column 26. The names are incised in the stone in alphabetical order, a democracy of loss that places the famous and the forgotten on equal terms. A general's name beside a private's. A communications liaison colonel from the Signal Corps beside men from the infantry, the field artillery, the naval forces. Beecher, Curtis, Colonel, California. The stone is pale limestone, warm in the Philippine sun. The letters filled with lead. It is maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, which employs a staff of Filipino groundskeepers who mow the grass and tend the flowers and keep the stone clean. They have done this for nearly 80 years, and the work is quiet and continuous and mostly unwitnessed. The name on the wall does not explain itself. It cannot. The wall is not for explanation, it is for remembrance. The story that the name contains, the 5 months of siege, the burial in the pre-dawn darkness, the 90 days, the book on the floor, the 3 words in the margin, is not inscribed anywhere. It lives in documents and archives in Washington and Fort Meade in Manila, in the testimony transcripts of the war crimes tribunals. Captain Villanueva's 1981 interview and Eleanor's letters to her sister in the annotated long translation of the Meditations that sat on a nightstand in the Richmond district for 36 years. It lives, now, in this. A final note on what we owe. The history of intelligence work in the Pacific War is not primarily a history of heroism in the conventional sense. It is a history of patient, technical, of meticulous effort, of men and women who spent years in rooms listening to signals that they slowly, painstakingly learned to read. The heroism, when it appeared, was usually quiet and often invisible. It looked like someone keeping their mouth shut. It looked like a signals officer staying at his post while the tunnel shook. It looked like a man dying in a cell, holding something that he had decided could not be given up. We know about the battles because battles produce visible evidence. Destroyed ships, captured ground, casualty lists, the dramatic topology of attack and defense. We know about the generals because generals make decisions that are recorded and analyzed and debated. The signals intelligence that shaped those battles, that informed those decisions. Its story is harder to recover because its nature required obscurity. The best signals intelligence work is invisible precisely because it succeeded. And if the enemy never knew the code was broken, there is nothing in the record to mark the moment of breaking. Beecher is an exception, of a kind. We know about him because the Japanese knew about him, because they captured him and tried to extract what he knew, and failed. The failure left a trail. The interrogation reports, the tribunal testimony, the cash recovered in the rubble, these form a documentary record that would not exist had everything gone smoothly. Had the signal section been successfully evacuated, had the occupation never happened. His suffering, paradoxically, is what preserved the evidence of his contribution. The smoothly successful operations left fewer traces. The men and women who did their work perfectly and were never captured, never tortured, never forced to demonstrate what they were willing to endure, they are harder to find in the record. Their names are on the wall too, or in no record at all. What Beecher's story offers is something specific, the clearest possible view of a particular quality of character and commitment, made visible by the extreme conditions that tested it. He was not, as far as the record shows, a remarkable person by the conventional measures of his time. He was a mid-level signals officer of adequate standing, a careful professional, a man who read philosophy and loved his wife, and thought carefully about the obligations he had undertaken. Unremarkable by most measures. Absolutely extraordinary when it mattered. The extraordinary quality was not accidental. He built it deliberately, over years, through the specific combination of thought and preparation and commitment described above. He made himself into the person who could do what was required of him. That is, perhaps, the most honest thing to say about him. He prepared. In the end, preparation was enough. Script complete. Final version. Visuals. 1. A wide establishing shot of Manila Bay at dawn. Corregidor Island visible as a dark silhouette against a pale gold horizon, morning mist rising from the water's surface. The island's rugged terrain and bomb-scarred concrete fortifications barely discernible in the early light. Muted blues and grays transitioning to faint amber. 1942 Pacific Theater atmosphere, cinematic and somber. 2. Close-up interior of a military interrogation room in a converted Manila warehouse, circa 1942, bare concrete walls with water stains and peeling paint, a single incandescent bulb hanging from the ceiling, a wooden chair centered under the harsh light, a Japanese officer's cap resting on a battered wooden table in the foreground, deep shadows filling the corners, warm yellowed light creating high contrast against the dark perimeter, photorealistic historical detail. 3. Close-up detail of weathered hands on an open book, the pages of a worn copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, the edges browned and one corner water-damaged, pencil annotations visible in a precise military script in the margins, the words, yes, this, exactly. Faintly legible in close focus, warm lantern light from the right. The texture of aging paper and faded ink, rendered in precise detail, intimate and quietly powerful. Script complete. The men who did the listening. Beecher's section in the Malenta Tunnel lateral was never large. At its peak, during the middle period of the siege, and it consisted of 11 men, 8 intercept operators, 2 analysts, and Beecher himself. By the final weeks, attrition through illness had reduced this to 7. Several were running fevers from malaria. They lacked the quinine to treat properly. One had a shrapnel wound in his left arm that had been roughly dressed and was showing signs of infection. They worked their shifts anyway. There was no one to replace them. The intercept operators, the men with the headphones, that's the men who sat for hours listening to the static-laced frequencies and transcribing what they heard, deserve more space in this account than the record allows. Their names appear in personnel rosters and, in some cases, in the tribunal testimony and the post-war debriefings. Most of them survived. Most of them went to Cabanatuan, and for those who lived through the occupation, came home to families who knew nothing of what they had been doing. Corporal Henry Matsuzaka, Nisei, second-generation Japanese-American, worked the night shift on the primary JN-25 intercept frequency from November 1941 until the surrender. His language ability was the specific technical capability that made the Army's intercept section more effective than it would otherwise have been, because he could listen to traffic that other operators had to transcribe phonetically and hear it with full comprehension, catching nuances of phrasing and naval jargon that altered the interpretation. He was 24 years old. He had grown up in Sacramento. He had a younger sister who taught piano. He spent the occupation in Cabanatuan. He survived. He came back to Sacramento in October 1945 and spent the rest of his working life as a bookkeeper for a wholesale grocery distributor. He died in 1991. He never discussed the Philippines publicly, as far as anyone who knew him was aware, with a single exception. A letter written to a nephew in 1988 in response to a school project about family history, in which he described his work at Corregidor in general terms and said, "We listened very carefully. What we heard helped people later, though we did not know how. Colonel Beecher made sure of that." The letter was in a shoebox in the nephew's attic in Sacramento for 30 years. It is now in the possession of the Nisei Veterans Committee's archive. Sergeant Marcus Webb, from outside of Birmingham, Alabama, ran the secondary frequency bank and maintained the equipment. He was a technical specialist of the first order, the kind of man who could diagnose a radio failure by ear and fix it with components salvaged from other units. When the shell fire knocked out the tunnel's primary power twice in the final weeks, it was Webb who rerouted the section's power supply through the auxiliary circuits and kept the receivers running. He did this in the dark, working by feel and the light of a single flashlight, while the tunnel rocked around him. He was captured at the surrender and was in the port area facility at the same time as Beecher, held in a different section of the compound. He later told the War Crimes Tribunal investigators that he had been aware of Beecher's interrogation, aware in the sense that he knew the sessions were occurring, could sometimes hear the facility's sounds, did not know the specifics. And he testified that he had understood, from the duration and the evident intensity of what was happening, that Beecher was not cooperating. A man who was giving them what they wanted wouldn't still be there after 3 months, he said. The colonel was giving them nothing. Webb was repatriated after the war and returned to Alabama, where he ran an electronics repair shop until his retirement. He spoke at the Corregidor chapter of the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor Veterans Organization several times in the 1960s and 1970s. At one of these talks, a younger veteran asked him what he most remembered about Beecher. Webb thought about it for a moment and said, "His hands were always still. Even when everything was going wrong, the colonel's hands were still. You'd think a man who was scared would show it in his hands. He never did. The weight of the archive." The National Archives holds, in its military records facility at St. Louis and in the Washington National Records Center, a substantial body of documentation related to the Philippine campaign. Signal Corps records, intelligence reports, personnel files. The proceedings of the post-war tribunals. The unit histories assembled in the years after the war by the Army's Historical Division. Within this archive, that if you know where to look, and knowing where to look requires some prior knowledge, which is one of the enduring ironies of archival research, are the documents that tell Beecher's story in the fragmentary, bureaucratic, partial way that archives tell stories. The interrogation reports, captured from the Japanese, and translated during the tribunal proceedings. The personnel file, at which notes his 1947 posthumous award and the circumstances of his capture and death in the economy of official language. Villanueva's debriefing transcript. Aldrich's report from Corregidor. There is also, filed in a box that bears no particular indication of its significance, a single typewritten page from 1948. The page is a memorandum from an unidentified Signal Intelligence Service officer to an unidentified recipient. The memo's subject line reads, Re, Beecher, Curtis, Colonel, Vos C. Posthumous recognition. The memo argues, in measured professional language, that the existing recognition, the Distinguished Service Cross, the posthumous citation, is inadequate to the nature of what Beecher accomplished. It argues that the specific intelligence protected and the verifiable contribution of that protection to Signal's intelligence operations in the spring and summer of 1942 justifies the highest available recognition. The memo notes, yet and then spends most of its length wrestling with, the fundamental problem. Full recognition requires full explanation, and full explanation requires disclosing information that remains highly sensitive. The memo ends without a recommendation. It simply states the problem and stops. There is no record of a response. The box moved through the system, was eventually filed, sat for 30 years, was declassified in stages, and then ended up accessible to anyone with the right finding aids and sufficient patience. The memo was there. The argument was made. The recognition was not upgraded. What the unidentified officer who wrote that memo felt about this outcome is not recorded. Perhaps frustration, perhaps acceptance. The intelligence world generates a particular kind of acceptance of injustice. The acceptance of a person who knows that the injustice is structural, embedded in the nature of the work, and cannot be resolved without undoing the very secrecy that gave the work its value. You carry the weight of knowing. You put it in a memo that goes into a box. You go back to work. What Corregidor remembers. The island of Corregidor is a 40-minute ferry ride from Bataan across the northern mouth of Manila Bay. The ferry carries tourists, mostly Filipino domestic visitors alongside a smaller number of international ones. On most mornings, the visitors come to walk the ruins, to visit the reconstructed Malinta Tunnel, to stand at the Pacific War Memorial and look out over the bay toward Manila's skyline in the distance. The guide who narrates the Malinta Tunnel light and sound show, a recorded presentation that dramatizes the siege through projection and sound effects in the main lateral of the tunnel, covers the essential facts of the campaign: the withdrawal from Bataan, the island's geography and defenses, the Japanese bombardment, the surrender, at the years of Japanese occupation, and the liberation. It is well produced. It conveys, with reasonable accuracy, the scale of the suffering and the significance of the defense. It does not mention the signal section. It does not mention the lateral 60 meters from the east entrance where 7 men worked around the clock in the final weeks. It does not mention the burial in the parapet, or the 90 days in Manila, or the tin box Aldrich found in January 1945. So this is not a criticism of the presentation. It has a specific narrative to tell, a specific duration in which to tell it, and an audience that is coming for the broad history rather than the technical margins. The Signal's intelligence story is a footnote in the context of the broader campaign, which contained 10,000 prisoners, 4 months of siege, and the largest American military surrender in history. The footnote contains 36,000 words if you start pulling the thread, and it contains the name of a man who decided what mattered and made it matter. In the dark, alone, at a cost that should not have been required of him and that he paid anyway. The ferry leaves at 8 in the morning. The island is worth the trip. The tunnel is cold and the light show is good, and if you walk the perimeter of the island in the late afternoon, when the tourist groups have thinned and the light comes low from the west across Manila Bay, you can stand at the remains of the parapet fortifications on the island's north face and look at the rubble and the overgrowth and understand, if you let yourself, what it meant to be here, what it meant to make a decision in this place, with your hands, in the dark, 3 hours before the surrender, what it meant to hold it.